Happy Wednesday, Manna Gatherers. Happy Wednesday on this first week of the Advent season. Yes, we are in the church calendar season called Advent, which is both the New Year season of the church year as well as a season of preparation for the coming of Christ, both the coming of Christ to Bethlehem and the promised second coming of Christ, which has yet to happen. And we also do not know when it will happen, because as it says in Matthew 24, but about that day and hour no one knows, neither the angels are in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. So we are to be watchful and ready, always preparing for Christ's coming. That's the season we are in, and we are traveling this first week of Advent with Mary and Joseph, who are teaching us about faith. God's steadfast faith to us and to this world, and our faithful response to God's call upon our lives. Hear these words of Mary in Luke 1. Here am I, a servant of the Lord. My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. God's mercy is for those who fear him, and from generation to generation. God has brought down the powerful from their thrones, and God has lifted up the lowly. God has filled the hungry with good things. 'Tis the season of good news. This is the real good stuff season. Love came down at Christmas, as that Christina Rossetti poem says, to which we have a hymn in our hymnal that uses these words and put to a tune. We are preparing for this season for love to be birthed at Christmas, a love this world had not known until God took on flesh and came to us as a vulnerable, sweet little baby. And it took God partnering with people like Mary and Joseph to make all of this happen, to come down into our world as both human and divine. Mary and Joseph taught us on Monday that God desires our faithful response to God's call in this world. And I guess I should have said, I assume people would pick up on it, but I should have said with words that we are all called. Some of us are called to serve in ways like Mary and Joseph, and others of us are called to serve in perhaps smaller ways, but no less significant or important. God calls us all, and as we will see throughout this week, God doesn't call the equipped, God equips the called, to reference that cliche for my point for Monday. Or I could have said it this way, I guess, another cliche: God doesn't need our ability, just our availability. Have y'all heard that? Mary and Joseph made themselves available by faith to God for God's purposes in this world, and it was a huge leap of faith. Tuesday, we were reminded that Mary and Joseph were given one another, as well as Elizabeth and Zechariah, so that they could take a leap of faith because they had the support of their community of faith. In thinking about what I said yesterday on Tuesday, I was reminded of one of my friends from seminary who is, I was going to say who was a Quaker, but she still is a Quaker, and she was attending seminary at the same time I was, to be a Christian educator. But during that time, during her first year, our first year, she felt called to be more. So as a Quaker, before taking that leap, she met with a discernment committee, something the Quakers called a clearness committee. People who would help her discern God's voice and God's direction and affirm or not affirm her call. And they affirmed her call. And they did that. They did that clearness committee with her as she was discerning her call to pastoral ministry, and they affirmed her call, and that gave her the confidence to pursue then a pastoral call to ministry, which included an MDiv instead of a Master's of Theology. Anyways, I imagine Mary, Joseph, Elizabeth, and Zechariah were together a clearness committee throughout Jesus's and John's lives, not just during the beginning years of their life or the beginning months of of conception, but throughout Jesus's and John's life, I'm sure Mary, Joseph, Elizabeth, and Zechariah served as one another's clearness committees. I love this Quaker tradition. We have a similar discernment process for those exploring a call to ministry in the United Methodist Church, but Quaker congregants are all invited to call a clearness committee when discerning any decision, not just the pastor or a person pursuing a pastoral call to ministry. Anyhow, back to today, to Mary and Joseph and what we can learn about faithfulness for them on this Wednesday. Faithfulness, let me just cut to the chase. Faithfulness begins with humility, begins with submission, humbling ourselves before God's will and not our own. Mary says, "Here am I, a servant of the Lord." A servant, of course, well, servant in the Koine Greek is often doulos, which is the word for slave. Servant, slave, those are not glamorous positions. And while we revere Mary and Joseph today, it wasn't easy being in their position or answering the call that they answered in the first century as an unwed pregnant couple. Shame, 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 shame. Nothing about their situation would have been revered by onlookers. And yet God takes what others point and stare at and gossip about. Oh, look at her pregnant with another man's child. Oh, that poor Joseph. He's marrying a floozy. You can imagine all the gossip mills that went around with when those two walked into town. Maybe that's why Mary sings, God lifts up the lowly, as well as offering herself as a servant to God. She knows that God means to bring good out of all circumstances. And as unconventional and uncomfortable and unglamorous, and even by some people's standards unrighteous as God's incarnation, the best news this world has ever received came through all of that. I am sure Mary and Joseph had to swallow a whole lot of pride to do the will of God, to not jump ship when the going got tough to pursue their own will instead of God's will, to somehow ignore the mean comments and the mean stares from others in order to keep their eyes faithfully on God, to have the steadfast faith to make it through the 33 years that they were parents to Jesus. Well, Mary, at least we know that Joseph was at least around until Jesus was 12, but after that, who knows? He wasn't around when Jesus began his ministry at 30 years old. Anyhow, faithfulness takes humility, humility before God in this world and within ourselves where our own insecurities and doubts reside. I guess we see in Mary and Joseph that faithfulness does not equate to ease of life. Their call was hard, but when Mary and Joseph offered themselves as servants, they took a humble posture that gave up their control to God. Did you hear that? They took a posture of humility that gave up their control to God. That's where faith begins. May each of us have such faith to give up control, to let go and let God, as Mary and Joseph did. I will see you tomorrow on Thursday.